Hey everyone, welcome to Apigee Up Close. I'm Irfan Baqui. I'm a customer engineer with Google Cloud. I work very closely with our customers to help them make better cloud decisions, cloud architectural decisions, and also better API management decisions. And today we'll be talking about how to think beyond the gateway. So let's start with the objective, right? What we'll be discussing today and what you'll be getting out of this talk is how to be successful with your APIs and have a well thought strategy driving your API program. And just to clear a few buzzwords here, by strategy, I really mean looking at not just your APIs, but your entire business and looking at the metrics that you're using to drive your business forward and connect your APIs to help you achieve those metrics, right? So that as a whole is what we call a strategy. And an API program is just a collaboration between your multiple groups, multiple functions within your organization to really drive the strategy. So here's the agenda. I'll start by setting the context by giving an example of what a successful API program looks like. And I'll do it through telling you about one of our customers that has been thinking very innovatively about the API strategy and their journey through multiple years on iterating through it and really being successful in the API program. Then we will pivot and we'll talk about how APIs fit into your company's architecture and what different approaches you can take to build your API program. Security, as we see it, is a core component of any API strategy. We'll talk about that as well. And finally, we'll tie all of this together into the main subject of today's call: how to look beyond the API gateway and really think about API management as a whole to drive your API program. And then we'll end with questions and answers. Let's dive right into it, right? So the successful API program I want to talk to you about was of Walgreens. And it's a very interesting story. Back in the days, Walgreens started as a classic brick and mortar chain of pharmacies. And really it was no different than any other mom and pop pharmacy. The difference was the scale. They had more than 8,000 stores. And the metric that they boasted was that they had a store within 5-mile distance of 75% of the US population. That would have been a success criteria, right? Because that's how you could tell how many people Walgreens could reach. And if they were able to reach those people, they would be able to sell things to them, and that's how they're successful. But with the advent of the digital age, we're all familiar with how Amazon has been disrupting a lot of different retailers, right? The classic story is how Amazon started disrupting Walmart and how Walmart really had to form a unique strategy to fight back. Walgreens was a little different. They were ahead of the game, and it basically started as somewhat of what I would call a coincidence, right? So within the Walgreens, if you have ever been in one of the stores, they have a photo lab where people back in the days would go in to develop their photo rolls and get the pictures out, right? So with the advent of smartphones around 2008, around that time, people stopped using the photo roll cameras, and the smartphones were smart enough to take pretty decent quality images at that time. So one of the ways Walgreens was benefiting from the photo labs was that people would come in to develop their pictures, and as a result they would buy something else as well, right? So the foot traffic was very beneficial to them. But with the advent of smartphones, then that had gone down. So they needed to think about the customer and what they wanted, why did they go away, and figure out how they can get them back. Turned out that they were still looking for a way to print their digital photos. So what they did was they created a native application to let the end users upload their pictures to that app and pick them up developed at a nearby Walgreens store. To do this, they had to create and expose the necessary APIs to the internal developers, right, so that they could create that application. So that was good. That restored some of their traffic, not all of it, right? So they said, all right, is there another bigger opportunity for us to get more foot traffic into our stores? So they looked at how exactly were the end users interacting with their photos, right? What additional things were they doing it? What other additional applications were they using to enhance their pictures? It turned out that there were a plethora of other mobile and web applications where users would upload their photos, for example, for holiday cards, and they would decorate the card with their photos and all of that. Ultimately, they would want to print it out. So they said, all right, how can I tap into those applications and somehow incentivize the developers of those applications to have those photos printed at a nearby Walgreens? Right, it solved their problem of getting the photos printed, and it gave more foot traffic to Walgreens. So it was, in their mind, a win-win situation. So what they did was, now they expanded the API program to expose the APIs to partners, so that they could incorporate them into their application, and really created an ecosystem. So this ecosystem, it started with photo APIs and expanded into a bunch of other services that they could offer, like prescription refills, to medical and healthcare applications, like purchasing their in-store merchandise with a partner like Postmates, like integrating Walgreens reward programs into other partner applications and all of that. So now with expanding into an ecosystem, they were able to really extend their reach from one or a handful of native applications into hundreds of partner applications. And that's huge. So that was as a whole an example of a successful API program, right? But what made Walgreens API program successful? I think the simple answer is that they had a relentless focus on developers and customers. Right? They started with their customers first. They thought about what exactly they wanted, and they gave it to them. And the method of giving it to them was through APIs, but it was still connected to their business strategy. There were two essential parts that played a huge role, and one of them was a developer portal and incentives, and this is how they communicated with their developers, with their partners. In addition to just exposing the APIs, they also exposed an incentive program to them. They said that, hey, for every dollar, for example, I'm just making numbers up, but for every dollar of revenue that you bring in to the photo prints API, for example, I will incentivize you 10 cents. So now there were a lot of developers that were making net new photo applications just to make revenue out of this program. So it was very popular. The second one was analytics. Once the APIs were being consumed, the way they really gauged how the users and the developers were accessing, consuming the APIs, gave them intel on how they could make them better. So these two components were crucial beyond just creating and exposing those APIs. So let's tie this back into how you should think about your API program, right? There are multiple different approaches to build an API program, but it really boils down to two major ones. One is a tactical approach, and the other one is a more strategic approach. So let's talk about both of them and see what are the pros and cons, right? So let's talk about a tactical one first. Let's make it a fun exercise, all right? Let's say you have a CEO or CTO of your company come to you to say that, hey, I've got an idea. We have this API service that we should really broadcast out to our partners. It would be a mutually beneficial move both to us and the partners, right? and he gives you the task to make that happen. How do you do it? So let's say now you are following the tactical approach. The first thing you'll do is you'll identify the service and you'll say, hey, how do I expose this out to, let's say, just one external application for now. And the solution you come to is just open up a firewall port, right? And obviously you will need some security in front of the service to make sure that you're allowing just the people that should be allowed to access it. But that's a solution. All right, you open up the firewall port, you add the security policy there. The next thing is, what about rogue applications, right? They can really crash your system if they call it too frequently. In that case, you would just add a rate limiting functionality and call it a day. Next, what if each API call needs data from multiple backends? How would you take care of that? Let's say you have some orchestration being performed so that an API call comes in, talks to 3, 4, any number of different backends, gets the response back, mashes it up, and passes it back to that calling application. Now, do you see what might be a problem with this strategy? What's not in focus here? Well, the customer is not in focus, right? You are really thinking about that particular service and how you would expose it out, but you're not really thinking about who is a customer and what experience you actually want to give them. Now let's take a look at a more strategic way to look at your APIs. What you're seeing on the screen right now is what we call a digital value chain, which encompasses all of the different entities that would eventually, in one way or the other, interact with your APIs. On the left, you have your users. On the right, you have your backend systems, right? So traditionally, what people did was think about it from more of an exposure point of view, and that's what I illustrated in the previous example. You have a service and you're just thinking about, how do I expose this out? I would mitigate some of the problems around it, like security and rate limiting that we talked about, but essentially you just want to expose it out. But on the other hand, the success pattern that we have seen is the opposite, right? Think about the users first. So when your user is sitting on their table, opening up their laptops or interacting with their mobile application, what is the experience that you want to give them? Once you have identified that particular experience, then you have to think about what kinds of applications would give them those experiences, right? And those applications would then be made by developers. So essentially, you want to make sure you're giving absolutely awesome APIs to your developers so that they don't need to worry about the complexities of your systems, and they can really focus on the experiences that they're building for the end users. And that's really in the hands of an API team. And a lot of you on the call might be part of such an API team. You would really make sure that you're focusing on the end user and also on your developer first, and creating those APIs, designing those APIs such that they are addressing their needs. And eventually then you would connect those APIs to your backends, right? That's where all of the interesting data and logic of your enterprise resides. So you would connect them to the backends to get the data, execute the logic, and all of that. This is how you would strategically view your APIs, but this also poses a problem, right? And that problem is from a security standpoint. We talked about all of these entities being part of the digital value chain, but the more entities you have, the more effort you need to put in to make sure that they're secure. For example, on the left, you can have a legitimate end user, or you can have a hacker, or you can have a bot, some bad actor that really wants to abuse your API. You can have really any application on the internet interacting with your APIs. So how do you identify that it's the right application that you have authenticated? How do you deprovision access of that application to your system if needed? So all of that's important. On the developer side, who are the developers that are consuming your APIs, right? Are they registered? Do you know them? Are you able to track them well? And if needed, are you able to drop them from your API program? Are you able to deprovision them? For your APIs, are they secure enough at runtime, right? Are they following the best practices and standards that your organization has laid out, both from a regulatory and from a compliance standpoint? And finally, your backend systems. Is the data coming in and out of your backend systems coming in and out securely? Is it secure? Is it encrypted at rest? Is it encrypted in flight, and all of that? And how do you also make sure that you're protecting your backend systems from a sudden overload in the API call volume? So let's look at how an intelligent API management platform would mitigate some of these threats and make sure that your strategy is also taking care of security. So at Apigee, we actually make sure that each of these entities are thought about cohesively. For example, for the end user, you would need behavior-based security to identify the patterns, how they're calling your APIs, and classify them as either bad actors or legitimate users, right? You'd also want signature-based security to protect your systems against the well-known OWASP attacks. And you might also want to do some fine-grained control, like looking at the payload complexity and making sure that it adheres to a particular schema that you have defined for requests coming in. You may also want to protect your backend systems from some abusive users if they're calling you APIs too frequently and have them spike arrested. So you can do all of that on the end user side. Also for the applications, you would want to make sure that you're identifying them, you're authenticating them through industry standard OAuth 2 protocols, and you are restricting them or authorizing them to access just the APIs that you give them access to. Now for developers, you may want to make sure that these are your trusted employees or partners. And to do so, you can authenticate them through an identity provider like Okta or Ping Federate. Now talking about your APIs and API teams, you would want to make sure that your API teams have access to only the APIs and even the functionalities within those APIs that they should have access to. And teams like your security team are able to set blanket policies for all of your APIs to make sure that your system is secure. You'd be able to do all of that with an API management platform like Apigee. Lastly, talking about your backend systems, you'd want to make sure that the connection to them is secure through something like mutual TLS and IP whitelisting, and the data that flows in and out is encrypted, both on the wire and at rest. So we talked about how to really look at your API program strategically, right? Thinking about the users first and also thinking about security as you are doing it. So what exactly is needed for you to be able to do so? The first is through developer management, right? Having a portal where your developers can come in and learn more about your API program. Maybe part of it is your documentation. Other part of it is monetization, incentives to use your APIs. Maybe it also has an integration to your support portal. Whatever that is, but any way for you to quickly onboard and engage your partners and developers. Next is analytics, right? So as they start consuming your APIs, you want to see how exactly they're consuming it, right? Where are the end users located? How are they using the applications? So you can look at all of that data and make your API program better. The next is operations automation. So as your API program grows and scales, you shouldn't really need to worry about the operations yourself, right? You worry about the APIs, you worry about your products, and the operations and everything else should just happen. Next is API development. As you're developing these APIs, one thing to note is that they would have to be developed quickly, right? Your developers and their innovation actually depends on how fast you're rolling out features. So that would mean that ideally you would have pre-baked policies like we provide in Apigee, drag and drop really quickly, change the APIs, iterate them, version them, and go to market faster. And finally, a secure and flexible API runtime so that you can process the incoming requests and the responses going out. So all of this together is really a core part of a good API management platform. These are features and functionalities actually that you get right now in Apigee. And one thing to note is that a very tiny portion of this functionality is an API gateway. So tying this back to the original idea of our talk today, thinking beyond the API gateway, when you really think about the users first and make sure you are tying your API strategy into your business strategy, then you would need an intelligent API management platform to drive that API program.